Nope, got it. We're ready.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good to see you all again after a bit of a gap. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Vivienne Baumfield, Professor of Professional Learning at the Exeter Graduate School of Education, Exeter University, not far away from us here in Taunton. Recently, I think Viv was made President of the British Educational Research Association, which is a very august body and a reflection of Viv's wide and deep knowledge and track record in the area of many areas of research and education. But you're looking back a bit today, Viv, I think when you were a teacher, or at the end of your teaching career, I think you said you started developing this technique. I noticed, I think you have a paper on the odd man out technique, a technique used in the classroom, and I immediately thought, oh, is that related to Kelly's triadic elicitation of a construct? And you said, yes, it was, and that was very exciting. So just to put a bit of a background on how we met, Professor Bram Norwich of Exeter University is an old friend. We used to sit together in Bristol University 50 years ago, would you believe? I think it was, Bram, in the Department of Mental Health in Bristol, where we were both research students, postgrads. So recently I came across Bram's name and contacted him, and you kindly invited me to join the theory group, which is a group of people that get together and discuss, I should say, rather difficult philosophical papers. And I don't know if Paul Ernest is here today as well. He's another member of the group, but that's how I met Viv, who was in that group. So I think that's all I need to say at the moment. Let me introduce you to Professor Viv Baumfield, who will tell us about her work in the classroom using the odd man out technique. Viv.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I was saying earlier before we actually started, I do feel like a bit of an imposter because I'm not an expert on Kelly by any means. I've sat in on some of the previous sessions of this network when Harry told me about it, and I've really enjoyed the discussions. So what I'm going to do is just tell you about some work that I did and how that drew upon Kelly, and I'm very keen to get your reflections and comments about it. So I'll get going. Which now there's a bit I hate, which is trying to share my screen. So we'll see how that goes. Right.
You want to put it on slideshow, Viv?
Yeah, doing that. Yeah. Okay. So you'll see that in the time-honoured tradition of invited presentations, I've changed the title slightly. What I wanted to do is get the point across straight away about my interest in Kelly in the classroom, and that's about finding ways of making what is so often implicit in a lot of learning more explicit. So I thought I would take that as the title. So I'm just going to go through with you the work that I did, and I end with a reflection which hopefully will guide us into the breakout rooms. So as Harry's mentioned, odd one out was in a way the starting point, but there's a starting point before that. So my interest in the work of George Kelly began in the late 1990s, when I moved from being a secondary school teacher, working in inner city schools in the northeast of England. And if you know about the 1980s in the northeast of England, you'll know that that was a period of deindustrialization and high unemployment. And I moved from that situation to being a teacher educator in a university. And I think that point of transition might be significant. So working as a teacher in two challenging, is the euphemism that people use, schools, had shown me that engaging the interest of disaffected students was difficult when the gap between their experience and the conventions of formal education was so wide as to seem impassable. I taught history and religious education, and was also aware that both subjects required conceptual understanding in order to debate and evaluate ideas. And indeed, imparting simplified facts was neither possible nor desirable. And if you were to impart facts, it would perhaps be more akin to indoctrination than education anyway. So I struggled as a teacher. I struggled with my dilemmas as a teacher in the classroom, but I didn't solve any of them as a teacher in the classroom. It was only when I moved into being a teacher educator in a university that I had the time and the space and the resources in general to gain the understanding to develop potential solutions. And my first significant encounter was with the work of John Dewey on the role of the teacher in building a bridge between the child and the curriculum, which is what I'd been trying to do and failing to do as a teacher in school. I wasn't a bad teacher, by the way. I think I was probably an okay teacher, but I really struggled to bridge that gap. And the idea from Dewey that I seized upon was the need to what he termed psychologize the subject, that you needed to be able to understand the discipline and the structure of the discipline, but you also needed to understand how learning takes place, and you needed to understand how the child was actually encountering and learning the subject. So that was the starting point, and this was followed by learning about the work of George Kelly via a pedagogical strategy that some colleagues had developed in a project about teaching thinking skills, and they developed a strategy called Odd One Out. And this is an example of an odd one out strategy. So this was devised in order to enable teachers to think about how they might use odd one out when teaching particular subjects. So it's pretty straightforward, obviously. What you would do is you would devise the odd one out depending on what subject and what topic within the subject you were teaching. You would come up with 3 pictures or 3 words, or if you were teaching maths, 3 numbers maybe, or 3 figures. And the task that you present to the class as a whole class activity is which is the odd one out and why. And that is the starter activity for the lesson. And so opportunity then to invite individuals in the class to give their idea about which one they think is the odd one out and why they think that one is the odd one out. And this is one example that was used in the classroom. And I've used this many times in different presentations, and you always find that people come up with different ideas and different ways of thinking about it. I won't try and make this interactive here and now, but you might be wanting to be thinking yourself, if you had to choose one as the odd one out, which would it be and why would it be that one? And that then leads into thinking about the reasons why you might have chose one of them as the odd one out. So a follow-up activity would be then to present something like this, which builds on the contributions that have come up in an oral plenary. Because of course, if something is the odd one out, then the other two must have something in common. And in the oral plenary, you will have found that there are different ideas in the classroom about which is the odd one out. And so quickly you come to the idea that any one of them could be the odd one out, depending on what you think the similarities are between the other two. So the similarities and differences. And that begins to give insight into the way that the learners are actually interpreting and thinking about the exercise that they've been given. And I'd just like to give you an example of its use in the classroom. So it's an illustration of what happens when you use this kind of exercise in the classroom. So this is a little bit of a story, a bit of a narrative, but it's from it's a real example. For both the teacher and her pupils, this was their first experience of using thinking skills strategies in the classroom. The topic was healthy eating, and the class was a group of 7-year-olds in an urban primary school in the northeast of England. The strategy the teacher decided to use is called odd one out, which is a simple generic strategy applicable to a range of subjects, contexts, and age of learner. The teacher selects 3 words, objects, or pictures linked to the topic of study and invites the pupils to choose which one is the odd one out and give a reason. The activity begins with a very wide focus so that any suggestion that can be supported by a reason is welcomed. But the teacher gradually homes in on those suggestions most relevant to the topic. The task encourages the pupils to exercise skills of categorizing and classifying and to make links with their prior knowledge and learning, both inside and outside the classroom. The teacher had prepared 3 large laminated colour pictures of an apple, an orange, and a carrot. And these were displayed on a stand at the front of the class. Odd one out was the starter activity for the work on healthy eating, and it was planned to last around 5 to 10 minutes. 30 minutes later, the class were still eagerly volunteering suggestions, and even the bell for playtime did not dampen their enthusiasm. One boy in particular stood out, as he was so engaged and keen to volunteer ideas, culminating in his suggesting the carrot as the odd one out, because it was an irregular shape and the other 2 were regular shapes. Needless to say, when planning the activity, our own thinking had not gone much past colour and fruit versus vegetables. But what was more remarkable was that the boy in question was the member of the class with the statement of special educational needs, who was usually inattentive and frequently disruptive in normal lessons. So that's an example, and there were many other examples. And we'd started off, and this is about teaching thinking skills, but actually that wasn't teaching that boy in particular thinking skills. He already had them. It's just that he'd never had the opportunity to demonstrate that he had them. So odd one out is a powerful pedagogical strategy insofar it is associated with higher rates of engagement, enabling teachers to gain insight into what has been described as the black box of learning in classrooms, and creates conditions conducive to more authentic educative relationships. The teacher in this example felt a moral responsibility to the child, who had revealed a depth and originality of thinking that had hitherto been invisible. And that transformation, that the other pupils in the class looked at that boy differently after that, because he'd had the most exciting and original ideas. He'd stayed on task. He didn't want to go out to play. He was happy to carry on. And the teacher said she felt guilty. We went for coffee and she said, I feel guilty. I've been teaching that boy all year I didn't know he could do that. And then she said, but now what do I do? Now that I know he can do that, how do I move forward? What do I do? And I think the key there is it was unlocking and giving insight into how that boy was thinking rather than developing his thinking skills. It was actually giving the teacher the insight and the perspective. So there's lots of other stories like that about using these approaches, but gradually I became more and more interested in thinking about what was happening in the classroom. And this idea of the communication and the insights and the authenticity of the relationships and how they changed, how the way the teacher related to the students, how the students related to each other, all changed, and quite rapidly and dynamically. And I became intrigued about that. And I became more and more interested in thinking about the teachers rather than the students. I suppose to perhaps oversimplify, I began to think, actually, students can do far more than we think they can do. And it's just that formal learning doesn't really support them in using the skills and the experience and the insights that they have. So what can the teacher do? And this is back to Dewey and building this bridge between the curriculum and the child. So then I got interested in the teachers, and that's when another aspect of Kelly's work came in, when I started to read about work that had been done and about using repertory grids and how might I be able to bring those into play. So in time, I became more intrigued by the changes, the insight into how the student was making sense of learning had on the teachers. I first used repertory grids to compare and contrast constructs of teaching and learning across a sample of secondary teachers in a range of subject disciplines, working with the university on thinking skills projects. How much common ground is there between teachers of different subjects and with different lengths of experience in terms of their expectations for learning, the preferred management of that learning, and the language which they use to describe classroom practice? Could discussions based on the constructs form part of a school's professional development programme to foster a cross-school understanding of teaching and learning? In individual consultations with staff, the randomly grouped sets of 3 statements describing teaching and learning activities were presented to teachers on a card. And an example of one of the cards used is to have 3 statements: pupils classifying things, pupils listening to the teacher and writing down what is said, pupils building on points made by other pupils. The task was to identify through triadic questioning in what way 2 of the activities were similar yet different from the third. Staff were invited to make distinctions according to any criteria, and their choices and the difference within these distinctions would begin to reveal the ways in which those particular teachers thought about, constructed teaching and learning. The constructs elicited were then presented in a questionnaire designed to allow teachers to give nuanced responses rather than encouraging over stark contrasts. The teachers shaded in a box for each item along the 25-point continuum to indicate their preference, what closely reflected the types of teaching and learning they would like to see in their classrooms. The extent to which they preferred lessons to have tangible outcomes rather than intangible outcomes, for example. The individual responses were sorted into the items about which participants felt very strongly and those for which they did not have strongly polarised views. The resulting profiles were presented as colour-coded sheets with items in red for strongly held views, orange, definite but not so strongly held views, or yellow, items where no strong preference was indicated. Participants received personal copies of these sheets, but they were not distributed to anyone else. Factor analysis of the teacher's rating enabled us to identify significant sets of beliefs, which was presented in a box and whisker diagram to show the range of responses and indicates where the majority of responses were clustered without revealing data about individual teachers. And that's what you've got on before you now. So what we did was we then shared those with teachers in each department. And it became a focus. So in departmental meetings, the staff were they all knew what their individual ones had been, but they didn't have to share those, but they knew what the overall profile was. And this was used to actually discuss and to think about it. And they got this so they could see what other departments thought as well. And this was used in schools the schools that participated use this in staff meetings to begin to talk about, well, what matters to us? What do we think is important? How closely aligned are we as a staff? How consistent is what, and why do we think those things? The teachers were in the main positive about the experience and felt that the process had been interesting for them, as it required them to articulate what they felt to be important and reflect on the choices they made in the classroom. One of the benefits of the use of constructs in teacher development could be the generation of a shared vocabulary that can render what is often implicit in teachers' thinking, making it explicit and, most importantly, open to discussion. And it was fascinating working with the teachers. In fact, in one school in particular, they got so excited about using this and they found it so helpful because rather than sterile and often dichotomous debates, it became something of much more interest to think about, well, how am I constructing this? Why am I behaving in this way? What am I privileging, not privileging? And why over in the same school, you might have in one department teachers with quite different views, or you may have a closely homogenous department and you've got a range across the school, which isn't surprising because we do know a lot about subject cultures in school, but seeing how this impacted on how they were constructing teaching and learning and what mattered and what was important was valuable discussion. And in fact, in one school, they took it further and they decided that they would do something similar with students. And one school actually trained pupils to start looking at this themselves, and they used images. They had 3 photographs of learning events in school, and they worked with each other. So the pupils actually worked on doing a kind of odd one out about where is learning happening, in which of these pictures is learning happening. And that then became not just the teachers discussing, but also the pupils discussing. And it actually got to the point where the staff became quite comfortable about having pupils going into lessons to observe and to comment on what was happening in the classroom, because they'd begun to develop this openness to dialogue about what are we doing, why are we doing it, how are we doing it, what's informing what we do, which is, but in all the instances where we used it, we found that teachers valued the opportunity really to talk about it. So that's been a quick snapshot into Kelly in the classroom. It started with my dilemmas as a teacher, which I couldn't solve, led me as a teacher educator to actually read some books about education. Unfortunately, the way teachers were trained when I trained as a teacher in England, they decided they dropped education psychology because that wasn't relevant. You needed to learn to teach a subject. The fact that you'd already got a degree in your subject, and maybe you didn't need that, but maybe you needed to know about how children behave, develop and learn, had rather gone by the wayside. that's England for you. I don't think it's improved much since. So it was only when I had the chance to read some education theory and to talk, particularly, I have to say, to educational psychologists who were particularly insightful and helpful, that I began to see ways to solve my dilemma. And Kelly started off through Odd One Out. I didn't even, I knew nothing about construct elicitation and triadic questioning or anything. I just knew this looks like a good technique. Saw it being used in the classroom and was amazed, and then got into a little bit more detail with repertory grids. But the road not taken. The opportunity to reflect on Kelly in the classroom for this meetup has been an exercise in nostalgia. It has been interesting to reflect on this work in my first educational research project, what has persisted and what has been lost over the years. Perhaps more importantly, to consider the reasons why work that produced some promising lines of future inquiry did not continue. To some degree, the early outcomes were influential in establishing pedagogical approaches linked to professional development that empowered teachers as investigators of their own practice. One difficulty was the association of the research with the label thinking skills, and the attendant risk of being considered at best a fashionable fad and at worst purveyors of snake oil remedies. Another was the changes in the conditions of working in partnership with schools, supported by local education authorities and school leaders, with the scope to encourage staff to conduct such experiments in practice. The growing predominance of the view that teachers have the expertise and schools do not need external partners for their development was perhaps a necessary antidote to being patronised by elite researchers, but has led to an insularity that limits dialogue. Within the universities, research excellence exercises to evaluate the quality of research and determine the amount of government funding available have not been favourable to such close to practice research. And the scope for teacher educators to participate in any kind of research at all is circumscribed by government policies controlling the funding and inspection of teacher education. But perhaps what goes around comes around, and we can still capture, critique, and reassess the potential of finding ways in which Kelly might enable formal education to be genuinely educative. Okay.
Thank you very much, Viv. Extremely interesting.
I wonder if I could ask a question before we move forward.
Go on.
Harry?
Yeah.
Viv, if we have time, could you, I'm very interested in that last beautiful slide that you had up with the graph. Mm-hmm. What, could you just tell us what the numbers mean and how it relates to the odd man out procedure or odd thing out procedure that you talked about, if at all?
Not at all, no. So that was so there's two parts. So the first use of Kelly was the odd one. That one was when we did the repertory grid. So that links to the triadic questioning using the cards and then using that to construct a questionnaire and then onto that. I mean, there is a published paper about that work if anybody's interested in it, which gives all those details. Yeah. Sorry, yes, that might have been a bit confusing. Yeah.
What about what did the numbers mean? What did the boxes mean in the diagram?
That was against the items. So what they'd done, that was showing the distribution against the items, so color coded. So how wide the distribution was.
Okay, thank you.
How many people in each department? Yeah. So that's a sample of the clusters and then what they thought about those things. So each of those is within the department and what the range was. Is
Is that making more sense, Mike? Can
Yep.
you,
Thank you.
do you want to ask any more?
I have a question for Vivienne. Something right at the end that you mentioned, that you found yourself thinking back over what had persisted in your thinking about the use of Kelly and what's been lost over the years. And I was wondering what sort of thing has been lost and what your thoughts might be about that loss. What did, what did you move beyond, if you see what I mean?
Well, I think the thing I found was I've not moved beyond. I mean, I felt like there was some really exciting and fruitful lines of inquiry that got sidelined, really, instead of taking them further to pursue it further, because this was very early beginnings of thinking about it. It's almost like it's taken me until now to come back round to it again, rather than staying with it and pursuing it. And what I tried to indicate is what the factors were that pushed that away. So there were, it very much depended on a certain set of conditions about how you could collaborate and work together on ideas about learning and teaching in classrooms. And two things drove that apart: the changes in the conditions of teachers and schools and how they work, but also the changes in university and what was expected of university researchers in terms of working on education.
That rings bells.
Schools. Yeah. And I became a successful university academic, but that took me further and further away from these early beginnings. And I said at the outset, I think it's significant that both of those, the closest engagement with those ideas was at that point of transition when I'd been a teacher for 12 years, knowing that what I was doing was not working, but not really understanding how to get it to work, into being a teacher educator. So I was still very close to schools, and I was working with beginning teachers, and at that point I had a foot in both worlds, if you like, and I could see more about how to bring those, how to move forward. And those two worlds, I think, have perhaps become more separate over the years that I've been working. There was a moment that they seemed to be able to work together, and now not so much.
Thank you.
Do you feel that the technique, actually, I just wanted to say that the technique is such a strong validation of Kelly's what's often regarded as rather a overcomplicated and strange question: how are these two similar and by the same token different from the other? It's supposed to be a method of eliciting constructs for repertory grids, and over the years I would say, or people say, oh well, we dropped the triadic method, let's just look for differences and similarities as dyads rather than triads. But I've always really thought that the triadic question is incredibly profound, and Kelly talks about it, of course, in there's quite a lot to it, the thinking, but this is such a validation that with a group of 7-year-olds, one question was asked at the beginning of a lesson, and half an hour later the children were still enthralled and fascinated and involved with just one question, which of course is designed to elicit their own personal and unique construing rather than tapping knowledge that's been indoctrinated, as you said, into them. So I think that's great. But I just wanted to also ask, to what extent do you think the sort of spirit of the research and the teaching that you're talking about can still survive alongside the sort of bureaucratization of the Ofsted national curriculum and standardized teaching expectations? Do you feel that it could be built into what teachers have to conform to?
Well, the point in time when we were doing the work, there was a lot of constraint on teachers, but they could find ways of using it. I think the biggest problem is the move after that it's the teacher's dilemma that I mentioned about once you've opened up thinking and you've got more insight, then where do you go and how do you move forward? And so I think it's still possible to find, I mean, the work that I've done is around what we termed powerful pedagogical strategies, so that there are things that teachers can use as part of their ordinary everyday teaching. The odd one out, that's easy to develop and devise, that opens up very powerful opportunities for pedagogy, because it really opens up the opportunity to psychologize the subject and to build this bridge that Dewey talked about. But in order to move forward, it requires the teacher needs a lot of knowledge about learning and about the subject that they're teaching. And it's easier to open up and get the insights than it is to plan how you move forward. And that is what's so difficult. We did begin to experiment with the idea of taking, I don't know if you know Dorothy Heathcote's work, on the mantle of the expert. We did think that maybe that might be a way forward. It's how do you make that shift where you do have to move forward as a teacher. Once you've opened up the thinking, you then do need to guide the learner down a particular path. And how do you do that with authenticity? And that's difficult. And because there is a need for, and a point at which direct instruction needs to be part of what you do as a teacher. And so how do you guide the child into that? And that, I mean, that defeated Dewey. I mean, his laboratory school had issues about doing that. So but in terms of from the teacher development point of view, the work that we did with the teachers and getting them to talk about what matters in teaching and learning, that had enormous potential and impact, I think.
So is there work to be done in keeping a balance between, teaching content and eliciting, construing? I mean, it sounds like there is a lot of work that could be done to develop a model that integrates those. Yeah. I mean, and I think, and so I don't think it can't be done by teachers in classrooms, but I think it makes enormous demands on teachers. I mean, particularly it demands on their understanding of learning and their understanding of their subject. I was just thinking, shall we have a little breakout session? Would people appreciate that? 10 or 15 minutes and then come back to further discussion? What do people think? You happy with that, Viv?
Yeah, whatever people, I mean, I just would be interesting to hear what people have got to say.
Yeah. So do any more questions at this point before we do that? Or thoughts? Maybe it'd be good to go into breakout for, say, 1/4 of an hour and get people to warm up with a smaller group.
I was going to say that it's actually how useful it is, having done sort of similar sorts of things with kids, particularly kids that are really a bit reluctant to engage, or they wonder what you're going to do to them. And it's just innovative, isn't it? And it looks different, and it sort of gets their imagination a bit. It's always quite fascinating if you've got a member of staff sitting in, watching that the child that you described who gave the answer about the carrot, of watching a member of staff see a child interact, say things, do things that they just kind of like, oh, they don't do that in class. And yeah, it's when I saw the topic for today, I actually next week have got a visit where because I'm educational psychologist, so I go out in schools, and I was a bit puzzling over what to do. And when I saw the topic for today, I was like, of course, how did I forget this? So it's a very, very timely, very timely sort of meeting, to the extent that I shoved a meeting that I had this afternoon. I've kind of shoved it back so that I could fit this in.
Excellent. Jeanette, do you want to put us
I
into
opened the breakouts.
Should we say quarter of an hour? Is that? I would have thought that was about right. And oh, you've done it. So
Yep.
Okay. You going to join one, Jeanette? There we go. Welcome back, everyone. Does anyone want to start with some thoughts from their discussions?
Debbie's got some useful references.
Oh gosh.
They've disappeared now, Debbie. I was just trying to take a screenshot of them.
Hang on, I'll put them back up again. We were talking about, oh gosh, the pressures on professionals to do things in a nationally approved way, an official way, rather than the way in which they would like to do things in the classroom. And I found myself talking about someone who had a lot to say about professionalization, particularly in education, a chap called D.E. Hunt, who was a bit of a Kellyan himself in the early days and is totally forgotten now. And I put these three references up into that discussion, seeing as you asked for them, Heather. Let me pop them back in again.
Thanks.
There's one. And then here's his two papers that are perhaps a nice way of getting into his thinking. Sorry, I don't know why it's not picking up the previous one. Bear with me, sorry, I'll have to get them up again. But yes, I mean, that's what struck me about our discussion towards the end, to the ways in which your efforts to guide the pupil's sense-making are increasingly constrained by, is it Ofsted in education? I mean, you know, educational organizations which worry about national curricula and so on.
Mm. Does anyone else want to feedback from their session?
I'll make a comment.
Mike.
I want to make a plug for indoctrination. I don't really mean that, but it seems to me that the biggest problem that we have as teachers is the bridge. How do you get from where the kids at, students at, to where you want them to be? And I think that I teach students who can't get into college. These are students who wouldn't be allowed into our college unless they're forced to take classes from me. How horrible. And my students cannot connect ideas. They cannot connect ideas when they read. They can't connect ideas when they write. And so when I was listening to Vivienne, I was, really riveted by the idea of the triad and getting students to make connections. But the thing is this, what she said was, once they're you get at their ideas, how do you make the link to where you want them to be from, what the constraint you get from them? And I think, I'm getting feedback, people. Someone is, I think we don't privilege our own expertise as teachers enough. I think that if you take a Vygotskian perspective, for example, that there is a real need to structure and orient. You start with where the student is at, but to give them the tools. They need tools to move from where they are to where we want them to be. I don't think we do that enough, because I think that we're much too concerned about their own construing processes, which is absolutely essential, but not enough. So I want to make a pitch for I think we need to be more directive than we've been, but only if we can be directive by taking the students' construings into account. I'm trying to be provocative here.
So trying to combine these two.
Well, I respond to that. When you say you want to be more directive, what is the risk of undermining the learner's activity in that?
I would say responded in two ways. One, there is a risk. But two, in my opinion, much more importantly, students need tools to be creative. Students need tools to actualize themselves. Without those tools, they're aimless. And that when we give them tools, language, how do you write an essay? How do you do math, etc. It's only when they get those cultural tools that they're able to create themselves. And if we don't give them those tools, we're actually stunting their growth and their creativity rather than fulfilling it. Because autonomy, I suggest, is something that develops rather than something that is already there. But I'm going to be quiet now.
Add to what Mike's saying, Adele, you might want to jump in with me here. In speech and language therapy, we kind of sit between two camps. We sit between education and the kind of processes of learning. And one of the things that we have to do is actually solve that dilemma, because you may be working with a group of children or an individual, and you're starting from where they are, but you're building the structures to enable them to move on. But within that building is a reflection on what they're going to do with that information. So you'll start with an assessment. Okay, so say you've got a child who doesn't understand how to link information together. You may start with activities like lists of how many words for vehicles can you think of in a minute. But you would then take that, and then you look at the extension of the ideas on vehicles, for instance, water ones and air ones and land ones. And from that, you can then go into things like geography. You can go into things like science. And as a speech and language therapist, especially working in a school where you are aware that there's a child who actually struggles with science, you may be having to go back 3 or 4 steps and work on vehicles, but knowing that you're then going to lead that into the concepts and the constructs that the child will be dealing with in the classroom. So there is this way of doing this. I mean, we do this on a daily basis, but it means teaching teachers a whole set of new skills including the understanding of how people learn language, because most of this is encompassed within words. And for a teacher to be able to take a child from a position of, oh my goodness, I can think about the world like this, to right now apply this to your science curriculum without getting bored and walking out on me, you've got to keep feeding back. So what are you going to do with this information? So how does that affect what you're going to do? So if I tell you this about leaves, how does that change your idea about what cows eat? It's about linking information. I'm not explaining this very well, but linking information in multiple directions, not just following a set line from, you know, the beginning of the war to the end of the war and all the people who died in between, but it's about the implications for the people who were left behind and the people who were not involved. And it's looking at it in a multifaceted way. There's a lot of conversation that goes on. There's a lot of writing tasks that can be done around that. There are a lot of art tasks. So it's about mixing disciplines. I often wonder why we don't expect teachers from different disciplines to work together in a school, and actually teach science alongside the history, or teach science alongside the music. I've done that. It's not difficult. But it takes that natural propensity of a child to expand their ideas once you show them how, and then to want to apply those basic concepts in all different areas. So, you know, from a therapy point of view, this is what we do, and there are lots of ways of doing it, but it's about having a structure around it, an education structure around it that will enable those processes. Because actually most teachers can do it if you give them a chance, but you've got to give them permission first. That's all I wanted to rant at you about.
No, it's amazing. Really good.
If I might just add to this, we're talking about a balance between the role of the facilitator and the role of the learner, and the scaffolding that allows the learner to move on to being their own instructor, so to speak. I think that problem-based learning really represents that process. It also has the built-in reflection, and working as I do with students of additional languages and also the training of teachers of additional languages, I have found that, in fact, the language barrier, which, like with exceptionalities, can be something that prevents the educator in the given situation to understand what is actually going on with the learner. In a problem-based scenario, you have the learner identifying issues and questions around the topic or subject, and then expressing their ideas about those issues and questions rather than the teacher raising the issues and questions, and being able to pursue their knowledge building, not only in the written form, but using the multiplicity of ways of expressing oneself until they are comfortable of putting it into the words of the language that they need to use. So there are methods which can incorporate an elicitation or a triadic elicitation, such as problem-based learning, which allows for structure and then eventual, as Michael mentioned, autonomy.
The other good thing about that is that you start with somebody who's talking in their own language about what they understand. You can then give them higher and higher cognitive levels, if you like, of language to express something. But because they're building it from their own linguistic basis, it's not imported terminology or imported constructs that they're then dealing with. It's constructs that they've built from the ground up. And so you're literally then building constructs.
Yes.
And immediately they're then being able to apply those to the rest of their lives, because they've now got a thought process rather than a vocabulary term.
That's exactly it. Yes.
So important. It's absolutely vital.
Mike, you put that out as a bit of a challenge, and to my mind, you've had a couple of brilliant replies there. Does it feel like thinking of some of your students who are quite challenging by the sounds to address the problem that you're raising. Can't hear you.
I think that what Sandy and Yolana have said is very rich and represents the direction that I think education should take.
Do you have another group's thoughts? Bram, you were wanting to ask Viv a question about the purpose of
I wasn't specifically wanting to ask Viv.
Well, you said you had a question for Viv.
Well, I had a question that arose. Yeah, I could say. I mean, it seems to me that I wasn't quite clear what the pedagogic purpose of the elicitation task was, because it could be various, and it could be various simultaneously. And I just wonder whether it's important to be aware of what the purposes or intentions are, so that one knows where this leads to in terms of one's pedagogy. So for example, it could be a way of engaging alienated students or pupils or children. It could be to build a relationship for that. It could be to see what their preformed thinking is about a topic or a task or whatever it is. Or it could be to help a group of children or individual children think in new ways, in other words, to be creative. So it could be a group task, or it could be all of them. And I think part of it's sort of where this sort of fits in. And I guess it was that with this a very interesting idea, or Dewey's idea of how do you connect the learner to the curriculum and psychologizing the curriculum is, you know, so where does this fit in the context? I think that was the question, really. Was that what I said in the group? Something like that.
You added quite a lot more there.
There you are, you see, elicited.
Creative. Any thoughts, Viv?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's at the heart of that is the teacher's dilemma, and that's where it can go awry, because if you haven't planned and thought through, if you haven't got an intention in the reason why you're using it, then actually how you then move forward becomes problematic. I mean, and it does have, as you say, multiple benefits. And I think for many teachers that the main, some were more, had clearer intentions than others in the way that they'd planned, you know, what was the exercise, what were the three things going to be, why those three things, where were they going to go with the lesson and with the series of lessons subsequently. But even when they hadn't thought that through, perhaps as much as you might, the thing that was powerful, and the part that I got more interested in, was the way that it shifted the teacher's perceptions of where the ability lay in the classroom, who was able, who was not able, who was cooperative, who was not cooperative. So it had an impact on the way that they understood ability and behaviour in their classroom. It always, in my experience anyway, working with teachers, it shifted that perception, and that was often, it was always troubling, and sometimes troubling in a good way, and sometimes troubling in a way that made teachers not really want to open themselves up to that too much. But the downfall of it is when you don't have a clear pedagogical purpose, when you engage without having a direction, which I think is your point, Michael, about, well, where are you going with it? And the danger for a teacher is that it doesn't go anywhere. And so it doesn't build and it doesn't develop, and in the end will perhaps lose some of its potency. Or the other danger, the other extreme, if you like, is that you lose the authenticity of a genuine openness to collaboration and conversation, and because you suddenly shift a gear into something else, and that can feel like, oh, you don't really want to know what I think. You were just asking me that so that you could make me do this. And that can undermine the whole thing. I mean, I know we've got an international group here, but that there's a TV program called Blue Peter for children, and that's where they pretend to make things. And they tell you that if you get all sorts of, washing up liquid containers and paper plates and stuff, you can make a spacecraft, and they show you all the bits, and then they start doing it, and then they stop, and then they reach under the counter and they say, and here's one I prepared earlier, and they produce this beautiful spaceship that's clearly been made by some technician somewhere. And I always think as a teacher that the Blue Peter moment is fatal, when you get lots of excitement and interest and ideas, and you suddenly say, and here's one I prepared earlier. This is what you're really supposed to be thinking. It's this. So yeah, that is a danger. But I think for the teachers, they've found the shifts in engagement and behaviour, bearing in mind the context. These were pupils and classrooms that were very, very difficult to work in. They became easier to work in because they had better social relations in the class. So that was a start.
Can someone help me a bit with, did someone want to say something? I was going to say, someone help me a bit? Kelly said that Dewey was perhaps his biggest influence. And I'm just wondering whether, especially with Dewey experts present, we could say exactly what might be connecting what is in Dewey with what is in Kelly. So it seems to me that the triadic elicitation is an example of one of Dewey's bridges, is it? And can anyone say in a bit more detail what might link the spirit of these two great thinkers?
Harry,
yeah,
my mother was a public school teacher, and she was very inspired by Dewey. So thinking about your question, my impression is that one of Dewey's principles is that everyone can learn and everyone has value in a classroom, and everyone is educable. There are no such thing as really ineducable people. And this seems to reflect Kelly's openness to people and their inherent value, and that they're worth communicating with and understanding,
Yeah. Respect for the unique individual. You put your video on, Fortune.
Sure, yes.
Somebody said something.
I did. There's a very good paper about that, which I could fish out for you by arguing about the Deweyan origins of construct psychology. I can't remember the author's name now, but I do have a copy of it somewhere. So I could send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be good.
It seems to me that two things that come to my mind. I'm sure there are many more. One is the sort of model of inquiry, and the model of experience, actually, and learning. Because I think Dewey had a concept of experience, which is not the empiricist one. It was one of the adaptation of the person to the environment. Because I think Dewey and Darwin, he was really building on Darwin, wasn't he? And so
Hegel.
and then that connects the other side to the Hegel, is the idea that concepts are in systems, and you can't have concepts that are not part of a system. So that's the sort of constructivism and the construct system. And I think it's those two elements that are sort of central in some ways to both Dewey, but of course I'm not a real expert on either of them, but from what I have gathered, I think Dewey did change his views somewhat over very, all powerful thinkers tend to do so. So I think that, but I have read something recently which was saying very much that Dewey's concept of experience is a very particular one, and was very much influenced by Darwin and the notion of adaptation. I think that's one of the features of construct psychology, and I think it's one of the reasons why construct psychology can't fit in with the sort of micro theory, empiricist traditions in psychology, the sort of experimental traditions in psychology. I don't know, that's just my sense of it.
Yeah. Well, we just have a few minutes left.
Just would like to say to Vivienne, thank you very much for your lecture, because I am doing the same. I come from Israel, and I'm a teacher's educator. And when I want to explain something, I give them 3 pictures of scenes of teaching. And I ask them to say who is the exceptional and why are the 2 other are similar. And each of them gives another classification. And then I write it on the board. And I show them how each and every one thinks differently. And if I teach something, each of them will interpret what I'm teaching in his own mind, like is construing the meaning of what I'm saying. So, and this is why when they teach their students, every student thinks differently about what and interprets her words in a different way. And I think this is I always use it in my first lesson. I give them this little game, and it makes so much sense to them that they will try to construct the meaning of what they will want to teach in their students' mind, and will be less concentrated on what they said and more concentrated on what their students learned or understood of their words. So I find it very, very useful to do it, and I do it every time. So thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Can I thank you, Vivienne, on behalf of everybody, for a very stimulating final presentation in this series. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And the committee are going to continue to meet on a monthly basis, the committee that organises these talks, and we hope to resume in September. So if you feel like giving a presentation yourself or recommending to us somebody you think would be stimulating and interesting for the audience, that would be great. If you look at the invitation letter, there's my email address on there, so you can write to us via that. And any thoughts that you have, Mike, I was wondering if we could put a discussion